All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Petovi Angular Team Meetup. I am Wade Harkins, and I've got Fabio and Jonathan with me, and today we are doing three panels on, not panels, presentations on Eslint. I'm going to let Jonathan kick us off with introduction to migrating from TSLint to Eslint. So, Jonathan, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Wade. Like Wade said, my name is Jonathan. I'm an Angular consultant here at Petovi. And today I'm going to be talking about Eslint, how we migrate Angular and Angular app to an Eslint, to Eslint from TSLint, and kind of what the roadmap for what linting in Angular looks like in the future. So I can figure out how to switch slides. There we go. A quick recap here. What is linting in the context of software development, which is what we are all here for. This is a linter is a tool for catching code, lint, quote unquote, that gets stuck in your dryer, parenthesis, compiler, let's say, and burns your house / application down. This is the actual explanation from the Wikipedia page for a code linter. I would love to know more about the story of how this came around. We love things that have managed to just like float on through from the past, seemingly unchanged, to our present day. Linters are a really useful tool for enforcing syntax, creating consistency between developers. If you have a bunch of programmers on a team, it's pretty unlikely that everybody's going to be writing code in exactly the same style. A linter is a good tool for kind of catching things that you don't, practices that you maybe don't want, things, undesirable habits that, you know, programmers inevitably pick up along our journeys, things like double equals, missing semicolons, just little things like this that are kind of like syntactical choices. This is a great way to keep your PRs from being really, really nitpicky. You don't need a human being to enforce the semicolon rule. You can have a computer in the form of a linter do something like that for you. Some migration basics. So TSLint, which is the linter that has been in Angular, I believe, since the very get-go, or from the get-go with Angular 2 at least, which is the version we care about, was deprecated by its creators a couple of years ago. The Angular team is migrating the framework to Eslint, which is a newer JavaScript linter that has kind of taken over the TypeScript linting space. Migration sounds like it might be kind of scary, especially if you have like a heavily customized set of linting rules and that you've maybe poured a lot of time and effort into setting up. But it really isn't so bad. There's a lot of tools out there to make migration easier. That's what we'll talk about today. So a little bit of background on TSLint and Angular. So just a little more context for us. This is an open script linting library that's maintained primarily from a company called Palantir. TSLint, as you might expect, it was written for TypeScript. It only supports TypeScript, and that's really one of the things that has pushed us away from this tool and towards Eslint. It was deprecated by the maintainers in 2019, so it's been about 2-ish years or so at this point. In the context of Angular, the Angular team went ahead and deprecated TSLint with the release of Angular 11. It'll throw errors now if you start trying to use it. And then it's still shipped with Angular, still shipped with new builds in Angular 11, but it's finally removed as the default linter from Angular, starting with version 12. Angular 12 plus actually does not come with a linting tool set at all. This makes me feel like a React developer personally, but there really is just the one game in town, which is Eslint. We'll talk about how to add Eslint to a project that no longer ships with a linter as well. So why are we making this change in the first place? The big move for moving towards Eslint is just parity with the wider JavaScript ecosystem. TypeScript, of course, is a superset of JavaScript, so anything we can do to, kind of stay aligned with the wider community is something that definitely can provide some value. Some nice benefits of working with Eslint as opposed to a dedicated TypeScript linter is if you have an existing project that you're maybe trying to add TypeScript to somewhat incrementally, you don't have to switch linting frameworks in order to do that. Your rules configuration, which will probably not change that much between different projects or frameworks, are now a lot more portable since you only have the one linter to worry about. And this just kind of goes towards like the wider community goal of tighter interop between JavaScript and TypeScript. Eslint also has one fewer dependency than the old Teslint tool did. There's no longer the dependency on Codalyzer, so that's something that can be dropped. There's some under the hood performance benefits as well, which we won't really bother to get into today. But if you're interested in more of the rationale behind why this migration was made, Palantir did a really, really good write-up of why they chose to deprecate the framework and push the community in this direction. Definitely worth a read. So Eslint in Angular. So Eslint, as I've said, is an open source JavaScript linter. It's the default linter of choice for a lot of other JavaScript frameworks and projects out there, front and back end. It's really Eslint across the board these days. Supports JavaScript, has supported JavaScript for a long time. We now have TypeScript support in here as well. In the context of Angular, support for Eslint was added in Angular 11 if you wanted to opt in and start working with it. It's not integrated into the CLI. Before this change was made, Eslint would be added to a project by default when you ran ng-new and set up a new Angular app. But they actually have chosen not to do that with Eslint. So right now it just ships without, like I was saying, without a linter as well. And in lieu of that being integrated in to the CLI, the Angular team is pushing developers towards a community-driven schematics library called Angular Eslint. And that's how we're going to do all of our migration magic today. This is a really, really cool little project. It has a lot of different schematics for migrating existing projects, CLI tools for adding Eslint to new projects. This really does take a lot of the headaches of this change out off of your plate. It comes with plugins for a lot of Angular specific functionality as well, which these schematics will typically roll in there for you. So in addition to being a great JavaScript linter, it also does have a lot of capabilities around understanding Angular specific features like templates, adding it to your build pipeline, stuff like that. Their versioning has recently updated. It was a little harder to keep track of at the very beginning, but started with the release of Angular 12. They have aligned the versioning of these schematics with the versioning of Angular. So your Angular Eslint version 12 schematic will line up with Angular release 12 and so on. Some notable changes from Eslint. The config file structure is, of course, different because this is a different tool. A thing that I like about their config file structure, it tucks away a lot of the Angular-specific boilerplate for you. That was kind of like at the surface in the old Eslint config. The Eslint schematics hide that away and just extend the user-facing styles lint config off of some Angular boilerplate, which I think is nice. Your app level rules in Eslint are going to now be implemented as overrides, which I just personally find kind of the whole format of their config structure just a little bit easier to read. Just a personal take on it, but that's something that I've found to benefit from. There are some notes from the Palantir team about the way that the internal tests with Eslint run, and they are not as well loved as the Eslint testing was. I won't pretend to be a subject matter expert on this particular detail, but there are some roadmap items for updating this. And if you're interested in more of that, you can read about it from Palantir. So now that we've gotten all this, without any further ado, now that we've gotten some of this context out of the way, we're going to do I'm going to do 2 quick demos with you here. The first is migrating a Eslint app to Eslint, and then the second is adding Eslint to a new Angular project that doesn't currently have it. So you should be seeing VS Code on my screen now. So this is an old project that I have sitting around that is currently configured to use Eslint. You can see here, this is our Eslint file. We have some custom rules applied to this. A few things like, if we look down here towards the bottom, an example of a custom rule that we're going to need to, or a user added rule that we'll want to migrate or make sure that we see in our migration. This project is called place my order. We have a component prefix rule stating that your component selectors have to be prefixed with this PMO arg. This will be our little litmus test to make sure that our rules are being mapped over correctly. So we're going to run these 2 schematics, and then when we're done, we should have an Eslint config file that has all of these rules mapped over from our old Eslint. And with luck, that'll be all we have to do. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to add the schematics using this ng add command. You'll see we have the package here, add Angular Eslint, and then schematics. will disregard my Angular CLI config messages here, and we'll hope that my internet connection is nice and snappy. All right, so this will install some packages. Wouldn't be developer presentation if we weren't spending a little time waiting at NPM. As you can see here, we now have the addition of quite a few different odds and ends from the Eslint library here. We have some of Angular's, the Angular Eslint library, and its built-in its plugins that it uses for Angular support. You can see some stuff around here around like template parsing and the like. Now that we have all of these resources added to our project, we can run the second schematic command, which is the Angular Eslint schematic for migrating your linting rules. We've added this extra flag here to indicate which project we want this to run against. And this will do its thing. So like magic, you'll see we now have this Eslint config file here. Sort of a similar structure. It's JSON. This should be relatively relatively familiar to most of us here. And you can see it's grabbed some of our old rules as well. So we have our prefix, a PMO prefix here. That's been mapped over to our component selector rule here, along with the rest of our rules. And then if we look kind of down here at the bottom, you can see this whole linting rule set is extending the Eslint recommended Angular linting options here. And then if you wanted to, let's say, maybe switch this from this default Eslint to some other, other Eslint options, there are a few of them out there. That's the nice thing about having something that's widely used in the community. Like Airbnb is very popular, but Toby has an Eslint rule set as well, which you can snag. That's where this would go here. And then this is basically it. You can clean up your Eslint stuff from here and probably drop that Codalizer dependency, and then you are all set. This really, the schematic here really does do all of the legwork for you. If it finds a rule that it can't map, it will indicate that in the command line here. But for the most part, I have not personally encountered too many difficulties with this. This migration has been pretty pain-free. The mappings between the Eslint rules and Eslint rules are pretty comprehensive. There are only a few edge cases that they don't cover. So that's migrating from Eslint to Eslint. Real quick, I want to walk through the process for adding Eslint to an existing project. This is a newer app. This is an Angular 12 app. You'll notice a lack of a lint script here in our package JSON. If I run ng-lint here, this will yell at me saying that we don't have a linter installed, but hey, would I like to go ahead and use Eslint schematics? And you know what, I sure would. So we'll add these schematics to the project again here, like so. This will, again, take a second to run, a little bit faster this time. It's installing some packages here. Again, we see all the nice little odds and ends from this library. And then this step is just a teeny tiny bit simpler. There's a schematic for adding Eslint to. This will update your Angular JSON, add your Eslint config file like so, and that's basically it. So now we've got our Eslint file. I think this snuck in here just a little faster than I was expecting it to. We've got a basic Eslint file here. This is, again, just kind of the Angular out-of-the-box boilerplate basic stuff here. Things like kebab case for your, your component selectors. Just in general, like Angular community best practices come with this out of the box, and you can kind of extend from here. And that's the long and short of it. Adding Eslint to a new project, we showed that to you guys as well. Some other useful nuggets to keep in mind if you'd like to continue exploring this topic. The rule mapping is really, really good, but it's not guaranteed. The Planter team does maintain a comprehensive list of rule mappings and the things that they do and do not support on GitHub. Once you've migrated, Codalizer can be removed if you're not using that dependency for anything else. I've personally never seen it used for anything besides supporting Eslint. If you're using an NX mono repo, there is support from the Angular Eslint team on running these schematics in an NX environment, but there are some caveats to be aware of. You can check out the documentation for more info on that. You can also add, if you have a custom CLI workspace configured in your environment, and you are tired of running these schematics every time you make a new project, you can add Eslint as like a default CLI rule to kind of get some of those built-in features for setting up Eslint on a project by default that used to come built into the CLI. Maybe one day that'll come back. In the meantime, if you want to set that up on your own machine, that is an option. Bitovi also has an Eslint config file out on NPM. It's our first public Eslint release. We're very excited about it. We love code quality and linters at Bitovi. Check it out if you'd like. That is all I got. Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, we actually have a link to that Eslint repo in the chat now. So that was a good mention. All right, so now we're going to move on to me giving a presentation on making use of Eslint to enforce accessibility best practices in Angular application templates. So let's hope this works. Okay, like that worked. Okay, so Angular template accessibility, using Eslint rules to enforce accessibility in Angular. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines use the acronym POUR to outline their accessibility guidelines. And that acronym stands for perceivable, so making sure that users are able to perceive your content through sight or listening to it. Operable, users need to be able to navigate your content and utilize your UI. This can include with a mouse or touchscreen, or using a screen reader, so voice command or just keyboard. Understandable, does the UI make sense, and does the content make sense? So consistent, intuitive user interface. And then robust, make sure that people are able to access your content with a variety of browsers and assistive technology. So does it work with screen readers and things along those lines? Moving on to linting, there's a monorepo of Eslint rules called Angular Eslint that includes a number of accessibility-focused template rules. It's worth noting that these rules specifically work in templates. They do not work on component bindings, just something to keep in mind. So I've broken these rules up into three categories. The first I just called general rule because it only has one rule, and the other two are broken into content-based rules and then interaction-based rules. So our first rule is accessibility valid ARIA. If you're not familiar, ARIA, or accessible rich internet application, roles and attributes allow you to define web content that is more accessible to people with disabilities. In practice, you are encouraged to use semantic HTML elements instead of having to rely on ARIA attributes. However, there are cases where things like trees where there are not native HTML elements to support that, in which case adding ARIA roles and attributes give assistive devices the ability to relate that functionality to users that they wouldn't be able to get visually or without the visual aspect. So in 2022, Web AIM, which is an accessibility site, did a survey of 1 million web pages and found that 74% of them were using ARIA attributes, and of the 74%, those pages were more than 70%, had 70% more errors than pages that were not using those attributes accessibility-wise. So another reason to try to rely on semantic HTML wherever possible. So looking at this rule, this will check to make sure your ARIA attributes are valid, and it will fail if an invalid attribute name is used or if an invalid value is used with a valid name. However, it doesn't check the role attribute, and this includes the rule does not care whether you are using a valid ARIA role or ARIA attribute with a valid ARIA value on an element with a role that has no connection to that attribute. So something to keep in mind. So for example, here we've got a snippet where we have a tree element incorrectly given a role of flower, which is not a valid element role. You can see that we don't get any red squiggly, so the Eslint rule is not catching that. However, it does catch the issues on our two tree items. So first issue, ARIA multiline is being given a value of red, which it is expected to have a Boolean value. So this fails. And again, even though we are getting an error here, it is specifically just because we're not getting a Boolean value. It's not taking into account the fact that a tree item wouldn't have this attribute anyway, since it's meant to indicate whether a text input field has multiple input lines. So it doesn't actually make sense. We've also got, in this case, a attribute name that is not valid. So this catches it as well and indicates that. So moving on to content, accessibility alt text just checks that visual elements have descriptive text. Going back to the WCAG guidelines, perceivable, so the P in poor. Guideline 1.1, text alternatives, says that you should provide text alternatives for any non-text content so that it can be changed into other forms that people need. So this rule helps encourage that. And then there's a success criterion 111 that says that all non-text content that is presented to the user needs to have a text alternative that serves an equivalent purpose. And a link to that stuff. It's worth noting that there are cases where a visual element may not need an accessible representation if it's purely decorative or used for some sort of layout-based purpose. So in order to pass this rule, image elements need to have an alt attribute. Objects need to have either a title or an ARIA label attribute. Array elements need an alt or an ARIA label attribute. And input elements of type image need to either have an alt attribute or an ARIA label attribute. So looking at the example here, we've got first an image tag that is missing an alt attribute. So we get this error. The image tag directly below it has the attribute, so the Eslint rule doesn't care about it. We've also got an object here that is in need of a title or an ARIA label. And an area tag that needs a text alternative, and an input of type image that needs a text alternative. So our next rule, accessibility elements content, checks that heading, anchor, and button elements contain accessible content. Going back to our WCAG guidelines, guideline 131 says that information, structure, and relationships conveyed through presentation can be programmatically determined or are available in text. So in this case, that's referring to header and anchor tags, which are used to build the document model. So if a header has no text content in it, then there's no way to describe it to, say, a visually impaired user. So that's important. And then operable, so guideline 246 says that headings and labels describe a topic or purpose. So again, not having text would break that. So looking at example, we've got an H1 tag and an anchor tag, neither of which have any text content. That wouldn't really make sense to do in practice just because you wouldn't see anything on the page anyway. Maybe a more practical example here is a button where we've got a class that adds in an icon. You might not think to add text to it. However, this rule will catch it and say that it needs to have accessible content. You could satisfy this by adding text or HTML inside the element, binding to inner text, inner HTML, or outer HTML, or using title or the ARIA label attributes. So you can see here at the bottom, we've got an H3 that doesn't have any text content within it directly, but we're binding to inner text and have copied the button from above and made it pass the rule by adding an aria label attribute. Next one we've got is label for. So this checks to make sure that all label elements and label components are associated with form elements. Our guidelines for this, we've got 131 info and relationships, which says that information, structure, and relationship conveyed through presentation can be determined or available in text. I believe I already read that earlier. And then we've also got 332, which says that labels or instructions are provided when content requires user input. The big goal with this is to make sure that you don't have label elements just sprinkled throughout your application that aren't connected to form fields. So there's two ways of connecting them. One is to make use of the for or HTML4 attribute to point to an ID on an input element. The other is just to simply nest a valid form field within your label element. So looking at this example here, we've got 3 labels. The second and third are valid. The second one uses the for attribute to associate it with the text field, and the last one just has a select field directly inside of it. And our first one does not pass because it's not in any way connected to the input field before it, and we get an error indicating that. So in Angular, you may be making your own components that serve as form fields. So you would find, for example, here, my form control. This rule is not aware that it's form control, so it doesn't satisfy the rule, and you end up with an error. So the way around this is to update your Eslint config for this rule, and we have 3 configuration options. The first one, control components, is an array of strings for elements that the lint rule should treat as form controls. So in this case, I've just added app my form control so that it will recognize that that's a valid form control. You can also specify your own label attributes that can be used alongside of for or HTML4 in case you've got a directive that you use to associate form elements with labels. And the label components array can be used to put in any custom components that you make that should serve as labels and have this linting rule apply to them. Okay, next we've got no positive tab index, which makes sure that you can only assign 0 or -1 to the tab index attribute, which either makes an element focusable or not focusable and doesn't interfere with the automatic tabbing order. So this is part of the operable part of POR. So success criterion 211 says that all functionality of the content is operable through a keyboard interface. So this allows you to make things that wouldn't normally be focusable, able to be accessed using a tab key. And then 243 focus order says that if a web page can be navigated sequentially and the navigation sequence affect meaning or operation, focusable components receive focus in an order that preserves meaning and operability. So this is connecting back to that goal of not making it so that tabs move between elements in a way that you wouldn't expect based on just the flow of your document. All right, so we're on to our last category of rules, and these are interactivity rules. First one is click events have key events. And this basically makes sure that any event that has a click event handler also has at least one type of keyboard event handler. So this will fail if you don't pair a click event, or any click event that's not paired with at least one of key up, key down, or key press will not pass this, with the exception of button elements, in which case just having a click event is sufficient, since that click event will receive or will be fired when you press enter or space when a button has focus. This goes back to the criterion 211, which I've mentioned previously about keyboard accessibility. So looking at an example for this, we've got our first element here. It's just a button with a click event handler, and that is okay because, as I mentioned, the click event on buttons can accept keyboard input. Our image tag in the middle with just a click event is the problem, and our last tag has a key press event which satisfies that the rule. So on this one, we get the error saying we need to accompany it with a keyboard event. Okay, our last rule is also mouse and keyboard related. In this one, we want to make sure that any element that handles mouse out also handles blur, and anything that handles mouse over also handles focus. This follows along with the same rule, 2-1-1, and let's look at an example here. So in this example, we've got a section that behaves as a card and then a button to dismiss that card that only becomes visible if you are hovering over the card. So this, for multiple reasons, would be very difficult for somebody using a screen reader to deal with. And in this case, since the button's not going to be rendered unless you're hovering over the card, there's nothing for the user to tab onto. So we get our error here saying mouse out needs to be accompanied by blur, and mouse over needs to be accompanied by focus. So the way that we fix this is a little bit more than just adding those two event handlers. However, I've added those. So we've got a focus and blur event handler. And also I've added tab index 0 so that it's possible to make or to use the keyboard and tab into the entire section, giving it focus. And without that, since sections aren't typically keyboard navigable, those two events we added would never fire anyway. So those three things together make it possible for this to both pass that lint rule and be keyboard interactive. So I've got a list of some of my sources, and that is all I have on accessible ESLint rules. All right, let's see here. All right, so Fabio is now going to talk about how to create ESLint rules.
Awesome. Let me share my screen. So we're going to be working on a Nginx app, just a standard result of Nginx. I have already set up Eslint for this, so we're starting from that point. And the goal is to get you all started with working with Eslint and maybe making your own rules in the future. So Eslint makes static code analysis. It will parse JavaScript, TypeScript, HTML, and maybe JSX, I guess. It will output an abstract syntax tree and then use that to evaluate patterns in your code. Now we're going to start working with custom ESLint rules locally. Usually you're going to be creating a package for this, but I wanted to show how working locally with this looks like. So I'm just going to create a folder here, which I'm going to call, I'm going to call Eslint and put that in our root folder. Oh God. Why the folder is not. Okay. Our Eslint folder, and I'm gonna create two files, package.json and index.js. Index.js file. So our package.json file has metadata on our package, which in this case is just a local package. And I'm gonna call it my awesome plugin. Yeah, so hopefully this is better too. Okay. And then for our index file, which is the main entry of our package, It will be a module that exports an object. We have a rules property. So our package could have multiple rules. And I have my awesome rule that has a property, a meta property that holds metadata for this rule, and a create function. So this create function will take as argument a context object that Eslint passes down to our function, and it returns an object that will have callback functions that will run on certain events in Eslint, or in some selectors when Eslint finds some specific elements in the abstract syntax tree. So now that we have our basic package, Eslint plugin package, and in a rule, we're going to install it locally, and we're going to do that using npm install, save dev, and then -d is short for save dev, and then file Eslint. That should be enough. Okay, should be in our package.json file, ready to be used. And now we're going to add it to our eslint.rc file. We need to reference our plugins, my awesome plugin, and then we can add our rule, which is my awesome in / my awesome rule. And then we are going to set up the a error. This could be also a warn. And 1 is also valid for warnings, and 2 for error. Right? For readability, I'm just going to leave it as error. Now it's saved. I can run nglint, but that won't do anything because our rule is empty. All files pass linting. That's good. Now there's something people who work with me know that I don't like to write tests. So we are going to write a rule that will prevent you from writing tests in this project. So we're going to call this rule no testing rule, and I'm just going to copy this into here, and I'm going to call it no testing. Also, it's empty now, but I also need to add it to our Eslint.rc file and reference this error testing. It should also return errors if this is dispatched. So, okay, now let's start working on it. We are going to set up a messages property in our no testing rule that will have a no testing message ID. This will later be, we're going to use this no testing ID, this message ID no testing in our create function. So I'm just adding the message. So I'm going to use this found, and then a file name argument, and then no testing allowed. And just as I have a coworker who's Canadian, he would do something like this. Sorry, no testing allowed. And then whenever this rule is reported by Eslint, this message should show up in our nglint. So the most basic thing we can do is to use the program event. This program event will run for every file. So in our, sorry, this is not an object. So program event is the callback function that's going to be called. Wait. It's going to be called by Eslint. And that we are going to use the context object, which has a lot of interesting functions and methods, helper methods for us. We are going to pass down the node attribute message AD. We're going to use the node passing. And then for our file name argument, we're passing down a data property, and that's going to be anything for now, some file. And so this should trigger an error for every file, because a program runs once for each file. So if we run Angular again,
I think you're missing an arrow.
Am I?
Or, oh, you're missing a T in function. That's what you're missing.
Thank you.
Welcome.
So now when we run ng-lint, should trigger an error for each file. And there it is. But we want to actually show the actual file name. So we're going to use the context again and use a function that gets file name. And that should show us the real file name. So here it is, using the real file name. Let me close this. Okay, now we need to run some logic. So this is only triggered to when we find spec files, because we don't want spec files. We don't want this rule to be triggered by every file. So we're going to store our file name. And then if file name includes a spec string, only then we're going to report this error. Okay, let's try it again. Okay, only one error now. It is our app component.spec file. And now to fix this, we're going to remove this file. I don't want any tests here. Great, now it should pass. All files pass linting. Great, awesome. Now we're going to create a rule for accessibility. Wade mentioned the click event has key event rule, something like that. Click events have key events, I guess. So we are going to create our own rule that will solve a similar problem, but inside classes. So imagine our app component. Imagine it's not the actual app component, but some component that is doing something like it's wrapping a div with some functionality, some feature, and we are binding a click event in our component to something, which we don't care about now. So we have our component is using host lister to bind click events to our component. So whenever there's a click event inside a component, we call the handle click function. And now I'm going to show you how this is, how the abstract syntax tree will work with this. So there's this TypeScript Eslint IO file, website that will show you what's the output for the abstract syntax tree. And that's how you find out how to navigate through all these objects that are generated. So you can see here that I mouse over in the program event, and it represents the whole file. And then we have the body, it has import declaration and export named declaration. And then let's go right into what matters. So host listener inside here is a decorator. So I mentioned earlier, we can use both events identified by Eslint and also use selectors. So selectors will actually reference any, in this case, if I use the decorator selector, it will be triggered, the callback function will be triggered for each decorator found inside this program. And then we are going to use to navigate the abstract syntax tree to run some logic. For instance, we have this class body, and it has several methods and properties, which represent all the members of this class. And each method that has decorators, it will have a property called decorators. Here it is. Decorators has one element, and then there's the host listener highlighted. And then if we add a second host listener, our decorators array is updated with the second decorator. So this is also, we need to identify the type method definition. We're going to identify by its type and also by its kind, which is method, because we don't want to run this logic in constructors or getters or setters. This example here has kind constructor. So this is what the abstract tree looks like. And when you're writing custom Eslint rules, you're going to need to use this to understand what's going on and how to reference different parts of the code. So going back to our code, we have our component ready with only a click event. We're going to uncomment these out later to test our rule. So now you're going to minimize this. So we're going to create the rule that is similar to the click events have key events, but this is for host listener inside the class. So we have our meta and metadata. We're going to add the messages array with a similar message that the Angular rule has. So host listener click must be accompanied by either key up, key down, or key press event for accessibility. And let's just report an error for every decorator. Takes the node, and then let me just copy this part. So now each host listener, each decorator actually is going to trigger this error as soon as we add this to our Eslint RC file. Then write Blossom again, and should give me an error. Now if we run Eslint, oops. we have 4 errors now. App routing, that's because we have a decorator, ng module. And then at component, we have 2 decorators, which is the component decorator and this host listener, and app module, which has the ng module. So now what we want to do is only report errors for host listener decorators that have a click event. So we're going to start this variable. And here we're just referencing parts of the abstract syntax tree. So if you look at the host listener, you're going to see that it has the expression property, and that's where we can navigate through it to find the host listener information. So I'm going to create this is host listener variable, which will be expression.callee, and this might be undefined, so I'm using this question mark, and then if it's equal to host listener. And then if we are not at a host listener, we're going to return. We don't want to do anything. So now if we run Angular again, now we only have 1 error because we only have 1 host listener. And if I add a second one, we should get 2 errors. Angular. Okay, 2 errors in the same file. That's good. But we're triggering and running our logic in a key-up host listener, which is not what we want. We want to figure out if there's any other host listener that when there's a click, host listener with the first argument click, we are going to figure out if there's any other host listener in the class, and that should satisfy our rule. And if there isn't, our rule should trigger an error. So let's go back here, and the next thing we're going to do is to figure out if it's a click event. So I'm just going to store variable event, it will be expression or arguments, or if that doesn't exist, will be an empty array. So we get an undefined event value. So our const is click event will be event dot value equals to click. So in here, we're checking if the event, the first argument is of type, it has the value click. So in looking like the code above, it will be if it is not a click event, then we're going to return. So now with the same code, we should only get 1 error. Okay, good. And then our final step would be we only want to report errors if the class does not have a host listener with a key event. So we need to go up the class, find all the members, and inside all the members, find out if they have a host listener with key up, key down, or key press events, arguments, that is. So we're going to create a function that will represent if it doesn't have a host listener key event. And we're going to pass down the host class body, which is if we go up the tree from our node, we're going to eventually find the class body that has all the properties and methods, all the members of this class. That's what we want to iterate over. So our host class will be, in this case, the node parent, I guess. Goes up to, and then if this happens, we're going to report an error. And let me just copy the solution for this function. And we're soon gonna explain this. So now if we run Eslint, it should pass. Okay, it passed because our app component has this key up event. But as soon as I comment this, then it will should error again. Nice. And it should also work with when we have host listener in the same method, because we only care that there's a second host listener with a key up event. So Eslint should pass now again. And we also should be able to accept key down or key press. Events. Okay, that's it. So let's understand what's going on in the function now. So has host listener key event takes all the members of a given class, and it will iterate over them. And if there's a method definition, member type method definition, and it's of kind method, because we don't want to look at constructors or properties or getters or setters. And then if it is a method, we are going to find its decorators. And if the decorators exist, we're going to iterate over them, capture the event, and look at if it is a host listener, and if our event is inside one of the classes we have here in a collection, then it will return true. So our class does have a host listener with a key event. And if it goes through all methods and it doesn't find any host listener with a key event, then it's going to return false. And if it returns false, this condition is true, and it reports an error in that file. And then that's all I had. I'm going to leave you with this repository where you can take a look at all the code that I've gone through today. And there's also some additional sources if you want to understand more about custom Eslint rules. And yeah, I'm open to questions or anything. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Fabio. I went ahead and put that link in the chat as well.
Yeah, I can do that.
So yeah, if anybody has any questions about any of this, now would be a good time to ask. Doesn't look like we have any questions. So thanks everybody for attending our meetup. Thanks, Fabio and Jonathan, for presenting, and thanks to myself for presenting too. Can't forget myself. We'll be back next month. Oh, Mark wants to know if Eslint will ever return, and will Eslint ever go away? So very existential questions.
Probably both. I don't know.
Yeah, probably no to the first one. And like all things, probably yes to the question of Eslint eventually going away. But probably not anytime soon.
Cool. All right. Well, we will be back next month with a topic which I cannot recall off the top of my head. However, that's a good incentive to click on the link in our on our Twitch page that takes you to our meetup schedule, so you can see what is coming up, which is probably what I'm going to do to remind myself. Yeah, and until then, thanks for joining us, and see you next time. Bye.